Kamala Harris is trying to move from vice president to be elected as president. The last person to do that was George Herbert Walker Bush. And before his service as World Bank president and deputy secretary of state, Bob Zoellick ran policy and speechwriting for the Bush campaign. He shared with us his thoughts on the road ahead for Ms. Harris.
Vice president is clearly an in-the-shadow position. So one of the challenges for Bush in '88 and now for Vice President Harris is she's got to step out of the shadow, inherit some of the benefits, but reintroduce herself to the public. She also has to try to figure out how she's going to define her opponent. And she's got a relatively short time to do that. So Bush used his convention speech to very good effect to kind of reintroduce himself, talk about his background, his story, kind of his mission. Critically, why do you want to be president? Yeah, people want to hear that to her. So I think that's one thing to watch. The second is her vice presidential choice. That's always the first opportunity for a candidate to take his or her own decision. And third, depending on what happens with the debate, that'll be another defining area because Biden had so much trouble, and now you sort of see Trump moving back and forth. As the one other thought that I would express on this is that in some ways she has a strength that Biden and George Herbert Walker Bush didn't have, which is that she's got a very enthusiastic base. Bush didn't have that so much on the right, and Biden had a little bit of problem with their progressives. That actually gives her a little room to edge towards the center and sort of send some messages. It doesn't have to be on big policies, but just even in terms of language on issues that I think could help her.
So George Herbert Walker Bush, with whom you served, succeeded. He won the office.
But big time, like 40 states.
But what brought him to that? Was that policy or was that actually politics? The vice presidential choice of Dan Quayle was not well thought of by some people at the time. But as I recall, one of the important things was how actually he managed to position Michael Dukakis with the Willie Horton issues on Law and Order, with the tank that he was riding around in. So how much of this for her is going to be, here are my positions, as opposed to not allowing the Donald Trump campaign to characterize her?
I think you need a positive, but also what we call a contrast, as opposed to sort of a negative side. Because again, remember, people don't really know who she is or what she stands for. So one of the things that Bush did in September and October, and people forget this, is that we had sequences of 2, 3, 4, 5 days. He'd give a positive speech, he'd give a contrast speech. The venues would try to sort of send a message. We'd have the paid advertising and would sort of hit the theme, including on weaknesses. So you remember we went to Boston Harbor and sort of put the environmental issue on the map. And so I think part of her challenge will be to find some of those issues where she can try to do the same. Now, but also, politics is partly political culture, just messaging to people. So Bush, as you mentioned with Dukakis, focused on the Pledge of Allegiance because Dukakis had vetoed a bill about Pledge of Allegiance. So, it may seem kind of basic, but it was a message about patriotism. If I were Kamala Harris, I would just hammer on the notion that I'll accept the result of the election, will you? And I just keep hitting that because you don't have to go back to the 2020 election, just say this election. And I think the average American understands if this is a fair play, you got to accept the result.
Bob, you've had a very distinguished career, a long career, largely in international economics, in trade and international economics. That probably won't be what this election's decided on. But as you look at Donald Trump as one candidate, Kamala Harris as the other, what is important in terms of their policies when it comes to international economics?
Well, the two do mix. I mean, what we discovered is people aren't so keen on inflation, right? And so that's been a real drag for Biden. And so if I were Kamala Harris, one of the things I would do is I'd sort of admit we haven't gotten where we need to be. And by the way, when you're the new person, you can sort of say, look, this didn't work out exactly right, but inflation's coming down, interest rates will probably be coming down. But then she could hammer Trump on saying, look, if you put on all those extra tariffs, okay, which are going to increase sort of inflation, frankly, if you try to jawbone the Fed on interest rates, if you try to deport sort of all these people, you're going to have a very bad effect on inflation and markets will react. It's a good example, David, of kind of how she needs to take a positive position, but then also sort of turn it. Let me take another one where obviously she's already started on abortion. That's a very powerful issue for her. And that's a part of her base. But at the same time, what she can also do is hammer Trump on sort of, well, look, the reason we lost Roe v. Wade, but then hammer him on his waffling. But also, if she could sort of say, look, this is my position, but I understand people that have a different view on life. The abortions are a very sad issue, and support adoption. These are little ways that she can be consistent with her base, but also kind of signal, look, don't put me into a box, because Trump's going to try to put her in the, as you said, radical San Francisco liberal box.
So you mentioned it's really tricky to both have continuity with what came before. It was George Herbert Walker Bush with Reagan. This time it's Kamala Harris with Biden. At the same time, you're saying you're somewhat different. And let me give you a specific example, the border, which they're going to necessarily tar her with because she was assigned to some immigration issues. That has not gone so well. What does she do to not just throw over everything that Joe Biden had said, but also have a break?
Another good example, when you got an issue like that matters to people, you got to face it direct, okay? And she needs to say, we haven't done everything that we need to. We're going to have to do better on this. And then, however, she has a gift because there was a bill from the Senate that Republican Senator Lankford encouraged that's got a lot of good issues. She should talk about those and say, Trump's the one who torpedoed this. And by the way, what did Trump's expensive border wall do? Did that sort of solve the problem? And by the way, if you deport all these people, what's that going to do on both a humanitarian and an economic side? So it's a good example. Acknowledge where you need to do better. People are straight. They understand you have to do better. She's got a positive agenda there that she could pick up on from the Senate and then nail the other guy.
One of the big issues for both parties has been our dealings with China, economically and otherwise, but specifically on the economic dealings with China. Does she try to distance herself or really depart from what Donald Trump is saying, or are they pretty much in the same lane?
I think the way that I would try to deal with the China issue for her, given her background, is to take a strong position on defense. You talked about Michael Dukakis and the tank. Every presidential candidate has to demonstrate that they're up for the number one job, which is the defense of the country. And so, interestingly, under both Trump and Biden, the defense modernization didn't really go where it needed to go. So she should say this is a point she's going to stress and that she's going to focus on modernization. She's going to work with allies where Trump has had that sort of possibility. So I don't think she has to be hostile, but she needs to understand if we're going to be effective in deterrence, we need to be able to have the military. And then, frankly, this is where she should take an issue like AI. And look, it's now reversed. Where Biden was the old guy, now Trump's the old guy. So she should own the future. She should say, look, AI is an important part of our future. The Republican convention, however, sort of dismissed any of the safety concerns. But hasn't everybody watched what just happened with CrowdStrike? CrowdStrike was the guy who was supposed to be helping dealing with cybersecurity. So whether it's biological security, whether it's sort of some of the issues on the cyber area. And so, to be honest, I think she's got an interesting hand to play. But, we'll watch. Watch the convention speech, watch the VP selection, watch the debate. And then if she could take 2 or 3 of these issues we're talking about, and just sort of move on them. And frankly, I think it'll drive Trump nuts, and that's the best thing she can do.
When you talk about AI, it takes us into chips necessarily, and the high-end chips, the Chips and Science Act. And one of the hallmarks, I think, of the Biden administration has been a move back into industrial policy. Does she embrace that, whether it's the Inflation Reduction Act with the climate issues, or whether it's chips and AI? Does she embrace that move into industrial policy? Because some people are not as comfortable with that.
She can't walk away from it. But I think what she'd be smart to do is, there's a lot of money being spent on this. Now the estimate for the IRA is like $1 trillion and so on and so forth. As we've had in discussions here, the budget deficit as a percentage of GDP is like 7%, very, very high for peacetime. Our all-time debt's probably going to make the 1946 high of 104%. I think she'd be wise, again, given kind of the position she has on the liberal progressive, to say, look, whatever my position is on taxes, I'm going to take a look at spending and sort of be rigorous on that. R&D is something that people can support. This is a deeper question. I think there's going to be a problem over time as you look at some of these subsidies combined with trade protection and how well it's going to turn out. She doesn't want to walk away from that now, but she needs to show she brings her own independent mind to the job. So the most critical thing, David, is, look, she can't run Biden's campaign. She's got to do her own.